I have conquered 31 worlds. I say this not to boast but to establish something important about the kind of officer I am. I am not prone to panic. I do not exaggerate threats. I do not file alarming reports to make myself seem important. In 4 decades of military service aboard Kalori Dominion warships, I have watched civilizations crumble through the cold glass of observation ports, signed off on planetary subjugation orders while drinking my morning rations, and written after-action reports so clinical and precise that my superiors once commended me for having, and I quote, the emotional temperature of deep space. My name is Vyeth Serrano, Commander, Tactical Division, assigned to the Dominion flagship Eternal Verdict. I have served under 3 high commanders. I have overseen ground campaigns on worlds whose names I have already forgotten because they were that unremarkable. I have never once in my entire career filed a recommendation to retreat from a target world. I filed one 11 rotations ago. It was denied. Everything that has happened since is a consequence of that denial, and I am writing this account so that whoever finds it will understand why I am now running, why the Dominion is fracturing, and why every sentient species in this galaxy should pay very close attention to the small blue planet circling an unremarkable yellow star on the galaxy's outer arm. The planet is called Earth. Its inhabitants call themselves humans, and I need you to understand what they are. The briefing took place in the central war chamber of the Eternal Verdict. High Commander Raventhal stood at the projection table, his pale gray skin catching the blue light of the holographic star map, his long fingers tracing a path through the outer spiral to a system so remote and insignificant that it did not even have a Dominion designation. Our scouts had flagged it 18 cycles earlier during a routine expansion survey. 3rd planet from a yellow sun. 1 large natural satellite. 70% liquid water surface coverage. Breathable atmosphere. Population approaching 8 billion. Category 2 civilization. That was the official classification, and every officer in the room understood what it meant. These creatures had figured out basic industry, rudimentary computing, and the very earliest stages of space exploration. They had managed to put a few of their kind on their own moon and send fragile little probes to neighboring planets, but they had not left their solar system. They were still burning fossilized carbon for energy. Their communications leaked out into the void like a child shouting in a quiet library, unencrypted, undirected, a constant stream of noise that our listening posts had been cataloging for decades. They had nuclear weapons, which our threat assessment team noted with the kind of mild professional interest you might give to a small animal that had learned to bite. Their warheads were powerful enough to devastate regions of their own planet, but posed no meaningful danger to shielded Dominion vessels. A direct nuclear strike on one of our cruisers would, according to our engineers, scorch the paint. But the detail that drew the most attention in the briefing room, the one that made several senior officers actually laugh out loud, was the political structure. The humans did not have a unified government. They had over 190 separate governing bodies, separate militaries, separate economies, separate languages. They maintained massive standing armies, pointed not at the sky, but at each other. They fought wars among themselves with a frequency and intensity that our sociological analysts found almost incomprehensible. Our analysts had a clinical term for this. They called them self-culling. It meant a species doing half the Dominion's work for us, grinding themselves down through internal conflict, so that by the time we arrived, the hardest part was already done. Raventhal activated the tactical overlay and began assigning fleet positions with the casual efficiency of a being who had done this dozens of times before. 12,000 warships. Standard deployment for a Category 2 world, though if anything it was excessive. We had conquered Category 3 civilizations, species with interplanetary capability and energy weapons, with fewer ships. Thal liked overwhelming force. He said it made the paperwork simpler, and he was usually right. When a species looked up and saw 12,000 warships blotting out their sky, most of them simply folded. Surrender before the first shot. Clean, quick, efficient. The plan was so standard it barely required discussion. Position the fleet behind Earth's moon, beyond the range of their detection systems. Disable their orbital satellites with a coordinated electromagnetic pulse. Jam their surface communications. Then send the proclamation of submission. The proclamation was a recorded message, translated into every known language of the target species, informing them that they had one planetary rotation to surrender unconditionally. It described, in precise and unflinching detail, what would happen if they refused. It had been used 400 times. Roughly 60% of species surrendered upon receiving it. Most of the rest fractured, with some factions surrendering while others collapsed into chaos. Either outcome worked for us. I was at my station in the surveillance bay when the proclamation was transmitted, monitoring human broadcast signals. This was routine. We always listened to a species before landing. It helped us understand what we were dealing with, identify potential leaders, locate military installations, map population centers. I expected to hear what I had heard from every other pre-conquest species. Confusion, fear, the frantic chatter of a civilization realizing it was not alone in the universe and that the company was hostile. What I heard instead was something I had not encountered before, and it disturbed me in a way I could not immediately articulate. The humans broadcast everything, not just military communications or government announcements, but everything, every thought, every emotion. Every trivial event on their world was transmitted openly, on frequencies anyone with a receiver could access. I listened to news programs describing disasters, and then, moments later, stories about individual humans helping strangers recover from those same disasters. I heard political leaders arguing with such venom that I initially believed I was listening to enemy factions in a civil war, only to discover they were members of the same government. I watched recordings of human conflicts, and they were nothing like the clinical, orderly campaigns in our archives. They were messy, desperate, close-range struggles fought in dirt and wreckage with projectile weapons and bare hands, accompanied by screaming and chaos, and a ferocity that seemed to bear no relationship to the strategic objectives being fought over. But woven through all of this was something else entirely: music, but not the structured harmonic compositions that Kalori culture produces. Human music was emotional, unpredictable, sometimes deliberately discordant, designed not to demonstrate mathematical relationships, but to provoke feelings. I heard compositions that made the translation software stutter, because the emotional content could not be mapped to any Kalori equivalent. Sorrow that sounded like beauty, joy that sounded like pain, rage that sounded like celebration. They told stories about things that had never happened and never could happen. Fictional accounts of impossible events delivered with such conviction that I initially logged several as historical records before my analysts corrected me. They had an entire industry devoted to imagining scenarios that did not exist, and then experiencing emotional responses to those imagined scenarios. This was completely alien to the Kalori mind. We process reality. We do not invent alternatives to it and then weep over them. And they practiced comedy. They found amusement in their own suffering, their own failures, the absurdity of their own brief and chaotic existence. They laughed at misfortune. They made jokes about the things that frightened them most. They seemed to believe that if something could be laughed at, it could be endured, and if it could be endured, it could be defeated. They were loud. They were sentimental. They were irrational. They were fragmented into nearly 200 bickering factions that could not agree on the most basic questions of governance or resource distribution. I noted all of this in my preliminary assessment, appended the standard recommendation for rapid ground deployment, and transmitted it to command. The proclamation had been sent. We waited. The standard response window for a Category 2 species was 2 to 6 hours. Most surrendered immediately. Some deliberated. A few attempted to negotiate terms, which we declined because the Dominion does not negotiate. The longest any species had taken to respond was 11 hours. And those had been the Thesari of Reach 7, who were in the middle of a civil war when we arrived and needed time to determine which faction had the authority to surrender on behalf of the whole. The humans responded in 4 hours and 37 minutes. They did not respond the way any species in 400 conquests had ever responded. There was no surrender. There was no negotiation. There was no delegation requesting terms or timeline extensions. There was no panicked fracturing of their alliance structures, no breakaway nations racing to submit individually in hopes of preferential treatment, no frantic last-minute diplomacy. What happened instead was, by every historical measure we possessed, impossible. Within 4 hours of receiving our proclamation, the humans stopped fighting each other, not gradually, not through diplomatic channels, Not after extended negotiation between their many governments. They simply stopped. Every border dispute, every armed conflict, every political standoff on the entire planet went silent within a window so narrow that our analysts initially assumed our sensors were malfunctioning. Century-old territorial disputes went quiet. Military forces that had been exchanging fire across contested borders ceased operations and began redeploying. Governments that had spent decades in hostile posturing issued joint statements of cooperation. Intelligence agencies that had been spying on each other started sharing everything they had. 8 billion individuals, divided into nearly 200 nations with conflicting interests, different languages, different histories, different grievances stretching back generations, looked up at the sky and made a collective decision faster than some of our own ship crews could agree on a lunch rotation. And then the reply came. Not from one government, not from one leader, from every major communication system on the planet, simultaneously, on every frequency the humans could reach, in over 100 languages. 2 words. Come down. The war chamber went quiet when the translation came through. Several officers exchanged glances. A few laughed, short, uncomfortable sounds that faded quickly. Raven Thal, standing at the center of the projection table, tilted his head in an expression I knew well. It was the look he gave to mildly amusing curiosities before he crushed them. "Brave little animals," he said. "Prepare the first wave." I did not laugh. I was staring at the timeline. 4 hours and 37 minutes. I pulled up the historical database and searched for comparable instances of planetary unification under external threat. The fastest on record was the Thessari, 19 days, and they had only unified 3 of their 7 continental governments. The humans had unified everything, every nation, every military, every intelligence service, in less time than it took our supply ships to complete a refueling cycle. I entered a note in the tactical log, a small entry, unflagged, buried in the routine data stream. Species demonstrates unprecedented social cohesion velocity under external threat. Ability to suppress internal conflicts instantaneously. Suggests deeply embedded cooperative instincts that may complicate standard pacification doctrine. Recommend enhanced threat assessment before committing ground forces. Nobody read it. The first wave launched 6 hours later. 300 dropships, falling toward Earth like a fist. I should have made them read it. The dropships hit atmosphere at dawn, local time, splitting into 3 strike groups aimed at 3 of the planet's largest population centers. The humans called these cities New York, Beijing, and London. We designated them Landing Zone Alpha, Beta, and Gamma. Standard doctrine dictated simultaneous multi-point insertion. Strike 3 locations at once. Fragment the enemy's response capability. Establish fortified footholds, and shatter civilian morale. It had worked every time. I monitored the assault from the surveillance deck of the Eternal Verdict, seated before a curved wall of 32 screens, showing live feeds from ground teams, drone overflights, and orbital imaging. I had watched 31 invasions unfold from positions exactly like this one. I knew the rhythm. Dropships land, civilians scatter, local defense forces mount a brief, disorganized resistance. Command centers fall, communications collapse. Within hours, the footholds are secure. Within days, the planet sues for peace. The dropships touched down in all 3 cities simultaneously. The first 11 minutes proceeded exactly according to model. Civilians ran. Streets emptied. Human military units in the vicinity engaged our ground forces with kinetic weapons, small-caliber projectile systems that fired shaped metal fragments at high velocity. Our soldiers' personal energy shields absorbed the impacts without difficulty. The rounds flattened against the barrier fields and dropped to the ground like dead insects. Ground commanders reported light resistance. Perimeters were established. Forward units advanced into the urban grid. 11 minutes. That was how long reality cooperated with our projections. At the 12-minute mark, the feeds from New York began showing something unexpected. Ground Commander Loreth, a veteran of 22 planetary campaigns, reported that the pattern of civilian evacuation had changed. The crowds were no longer simply running from the landing zones in random panic. They were moving in organized groups, along specific routes, with a coordination that suggested guidance. Loreth assumed the city's physical layout was channeling movement along major roads. He was wrong, and the error was significant. In the 4 hours between our proclamation and our landing, someone, and we never identified who, had organized a complete evacuation framework for the civilian population. Specific routes through underground transit tunnels, designated shelter points, communication chains using the humans' portable electronic devices. While we had been preparing our assault, the humans had been preparing their response, and their preparation was not limited to getting civilians out of the way. It was about getting soldiers in. By the time Loreth recognized what was happening, the buildings around his perimeter were no longer occupied by frightened non-combatants. They were occupied by fighters who had moved in along the same routes the civilians had used to move out, slipping through tunnels and side streets and maintenance corridors, while our attention was focused on the main roads. The first coordinated ambush struck a Dominion patrol of 8 soldiers crossing what the humans call an intersection. The squad was in standard formation, shields active, weapons ready, moving with the careful efficiency that comes from years of training and experience. They were 4 steps into the open ground when the world around them detonated. The humans had placed explosive devices inside the walls of the buildings on both sides of the intersection. Not military-grade ordnance. Chemical compounds assembled from commercially available materials, packed with metal fragments, triggered remotely, using civilian communication devices. Each individual charge was too weak to penetrate Dominion personal shielding. The humans had used 47 of them simultaneously. The combined electromagnetic disruption overloaded the shield generators for 1.3 seconds. That was enough. The metal fragments did the rest. 8 soldiers, gone. In less than 2 seconds. Taken out by weapons built from hardware store supplies and triggered by a device designed for sharing personal photographs. The pattern replicated across all 3 cities within the hour. Not identically. That was the unsettling part. Each city's defenders used different tactics, different materials, different approaches, as if there was no central playbook but rather a shared understanding of principles that each group interpreted independently. In Beijing, the humans collapsed 3 major bridges connecting the landing zone to the surrounding districts, trapping our forward units in a confined area where every rooftop and window became a firing position. The bridges were massive engineering achievements. The humans demolished them without hesitation, destroying years of their own construction work in minutes to deny us freedom of movement. In London, they flooded the underground transit system. Miles of tunnels that could have served as rapid transit routes for our forces were rendered impassable by the humans' own hand. They did not simply block the tunnels. They destroyed the pumping systems that kept the tunnels dry, allowing the river water that their infrastructure had held back for over a century to reclaim the passages. In New York, Loreth reported something that made me set down my data tablet and stare at the screen in silence. The humans had introduced industrial chemicals into the water distribution system in the sectors we controlled. Not a targeted attack on our soldiers, who did not drink local water. An attack on the infrastructure itself, rendering the entire zone uninhabitable, denying us the use of any facility that required clean water, which was effectively all of them. They were destroying their own city, methodically, strategically, without hesitation, not to save it, to make it useless to us, to ensure that every building we captured was a hollow shell, every resource we seized was contaminated, every road we controlled led to a dead end. I pulled up the intelligence files on human military history. I had skimmed them before the invasion, as I did with every target species, giving them the same cursory attention I would give to the dietary habits of livestock. This time, I read every word. What I found was not a record of occasional conflicts. It was a continuous, unbroken chronicle of organized violence, stretching back to the very earliest records of the species. These creatures had been fighting for as long as they had existed, not as an anomaly, not as a periodic disruption to an otherwise peaceful existence, but as a constant, a background condition, an environment. They had not merely fought wars, they had built entire intellectual traditions around the study of warfare. They had academies devoted to training their young in the methods of combat. They had libraries full of texts analyzing strategy, tactics, logistics, intelligence, counterintelligence, psychological operations, guerrilla resistance, and a dozen other sub-disciplines, each one refined over centuries of practical application. They had produced individuals whose entire contribution to their civilization consisted of finding more effective ways to defeat enemies, and they celebrated these individuals as heroes. They had a concept called scorched earth. The translation was imperfect, but the meaning was clear. When facing an advancing enemy, destroy everything of value in their path, including your own resources, your own infrastructure, your own territory, not to win, to ensure the enemy cannot win either, to make victory so costly that the invader chokes on it. The Kalori do not have this concept. We fight to acquire. The idea of destroying what you are defending rather than allowing the enemy to use it was, within our framework of understanding, irrational to the point of pathology. The humans did not see it as irrational. They saw it as obvious. As darkness fell over New York on the first day, Lorith's situation reports took on a quality I had never heard from a ground commander in 31 campaigns. He was not panicking. Lorith did not panic. But there was a tightness in his voice, a careful precision in his word choices, that told me he was managing something he had not expected to manage. The humans had shifted entirely to night operations. They attacked in darkness, in rain, in the smoke of fires they had deliberately set in their own buildings. Our soldiers' thermal detection systems, calibrated for species that ran cooler than their environment, were overwhelmed by the heat signatures of the burning city. Every surface radiated warmth. Every shadow could contain a fighter. The humans moved through the smoke and chaos as if it were their natural habitat, as if they had been born for exactly this kind of close quarters, low visibility, high-intensity combat. Because, I realized with a sickening clarity as I reviewed their history, this was not new to them. They had been fighting in burning cities for centuries. They had entire training programs devoted to urban combat. They had doctrine for it, manuals, specialized equipment. They had been preparing for this exact scenario their entire existence. Only the enemy had previously always been other humans. We were just the latest opponent to walk into a killing ground they had been perfecting since before the Kalori discovered spaceflight. On the second night of the invasion, a human unit in London executed a maneuver that our tacticians later studied in detail and still could not fully believe. A squad of 12 fighters, none of them professional soldiers, entered the sewer system beneath our forward operating base. They navigated 2 kilometers of tunnels in total darkness, carrying equipment they had assembled from construction materials and household electronics. They emerged inside our perimeter through a drainage access point that our security sweep had classified as too small for entry. It was too small for a Kalori. It was not too small for a human willing to crawl on their stomach through filth and darkness for 40 minutes. They disabled the power coupling on 3 armored vehicles, planted charges on our communication relay, and withdrew through the same tunnel before anyone detected their presence. We did not know they had been there until the charges detonated 30 minutes later, at the exact moment a supply convoy was passing through the area. The timing was not coincidental. They had been watching our logistics schedule. They knew when the convoy would arrive. They had planned every element of the operation around a window of opportunity measured in seconds. 12 civilians. No military training. No advanced equipment. No support from any command structure. They simply decided to act, figured out how, and did it. This was not an isolated incident. Across all 3 cities, small independent groups of humans were conducting operations of increasing sophistication, each one tailored to local conditions, each one exploiting vulnerabilities that our doctrine did not anticipate because no previous enemy had thought to look for them. There was no central command coordinating these actions. There did not need to be. The humans seemed to operate on a shared set of principles that each group interpreted and applied independently, producing a resistance that was simultaneously organized and anarchic, predictable in its determination, and completely unpredictable in its methods. They used improvised weapons with a creativity that our ordnance specialists found genuinely disturbing. Explosive devices constructed from kitchen implements, incendiary compounds mixed from household cleaning products, communication jammers built from consumer electronics. One device recovered intact from an unexploded trap in London consisted of a metal cooking vessel, a civilian telecommunications unit, and a quantity of metal fasteners. It was crude, ugly, assembled in what appeared to be a residential kitchen. Our engineers estimated it would have been lethal to anyone within 15 meters. At the 72-hour mark, I compiled the casualty reports from all 3 landing zones. I read the numbers 4 times because each time I was convinced the data was corrupted. 40% losses. The first wave had lost 40% of its deployed forces in 72 hours. I searched the entire Dominion military archive for any precedent. The historical average for first-wave casualties across all 400 previous conquests was 6%, not 6% per day, 6% total, for the entire campaign. The worst losses we had ever sustained in an opening phase were 14% against the Ven Confederacy, a Category 3 civilization with orbital defense platforms and directed energy weapons. The humans had no orbital platforms, no energy weapons, no shields, no fleet. Nothing but projectile weapons, improvised explosives, and an apparently inexhaustible supply of ingenuity and fury. I compiled these figures into a revised threat assessment, marked urgent, and submitted it directly to Raventhal. I recommended an immediate pause in ground operations. I recommended pulling all forces back to orbit for a full tactical reassessment. I recommended, carefully and precisely, that the Dominion reconsider its classification of this species. Thal read my report. He set it down on the projection table. He looked at me with the expression senior Kalori officers use when a subordinate has said something embarrassing in front of colleagues. "Commander Serrano," he said, in a tone that could have frozen atmosphere, "they are primates with projectile weapons. They cannot reach us in orbit. They have no fleet, no shields, no faster-than-light capability. We have 12,000 warships and the resources of 400 conquered worlds. They have determination, and nothing else." He paused. "Determination is not a strategic asset. Send the second wave. Double the ground force. And do not submit another report like this one." I returned to my surveillance station. On one of the ground feeds, I could see 2 human soldiers crouched behind a collapsed section of wall. One of them was injured, wrapping a strip of fabric torn from his own clothing around a wound on his forearm. The other was crouched beside him, talking rapidly, his face animated, gesturing with his hands. I activated the translator. The wounded soldier was telling a story, not a tactical report, not a situation update, a story, apparently humorous, about something that had happened to him before the war. The other soldier was laughing. Both of them were in a ruined building, surrounded by debris, with Dominion forces less than 200 meters away, and one of them was telling jokes while the other one laughed. I turned off the translator and sat in silence. My hands were trembling against the console. I did not understand why. I had watched soldiers from 31 species face combat, and I had never seen anything like this. Fear I understood. Courage I understood. Discipline I understood. But this was something else. This was a species that responded to mortal danger with humor, that found something to laugh about in the middle of destruction, that treated the worst moment of their lives as material for entertainment. It was, I realized, a form of defiance so fundamental that it operated below the level of conscious decision. They were not choosing to be brave. They simply did not know how to be anything else. That night, I opened my private log and wrote an entry I knew no one would read. They do not fight like a species that hopes to survive. They fight like a species that has already decided the enemy will not. These are not the same thing, and we have made a terrible error in assuming they were. The second wave deployed the following morning. 20,000 additional troops, armored vehicles, close air support, orbital targeting capability for precision strikes on identified resistance positions. It made no difference. The humans had spent the first 72 hours not merely fighting, but learning. They had studied our patrol patterns, our communication frequencies, our response times, our rules of engagement. They had captured equipment and dismantled it. They had observed our soldiers' movements and identified the limitations of our shield technology, our sensor capabilities, our tactical decision-making processes. By the time the second wave arrived, we were no longer fighting the same enemy we had engaged 3 days earlier. We were fighting a smarter, better equipped, more dangerous version of that enemy, one that had incorporated everything it had learned about us into its tactics and was already working on the next iteration. A 19-year-old student in a city called Sao Paulo, a young woman named Katie Brennan who had never held a weapon before the invasion, built a device in a residential garage that could disrupt the magnetic cohesion of our ground vehicle's shield generators. She used components from an automobile battery, a radio transmitter, and a broken computer display. Our technical division spent 2 full days analyzing the captured device, trying to understand how she had determined the resonance frequency of our shielding. She had no formal physics training. She had figured it out by watching our vehicles drive past her window and listening to the sound they made. In a city called Mumbai, a retired civil engineer named Darren Holt constructed a navigational jamming system from parts salvaged from a household cooking appliance. When our dropship pilots began reporting instrument anomalies over the city, our electronic warfare specialists assumed the humans had somehow captured intact Dominion countermeasure equipment. They had not. Darren Holt had reverse-engineered the operating principles of our navigation systems by observing the electromagnetic emissions of our ships during low-altitude passes. He had built his jammer in his kitchen. It worked better than anything in our own countermeasure inventory. These were not isolated incidents. Across the planet, ordinary humans with no military training, no advanced education, no access to sophisticated laboratories, were independently developing countermeasures to Dominion technology, using nothing but observation, ingenuity, and whatever materials they could find in their homes and workplaces. Our intelligence division began maintaining a log of human innovations. Within 2 weeks, the log ran to over 300 entries. The most alarming development was the reverse engineering. A pulse rifle captured on the first day of the ground campaign was being mass replicated in a factory in a city called Sheffield by the 9th day. Not crudely copied, reverse engineered, optimized, and improved. The human versions were lighter than our originals. They fired faster. Their energy cells lasted longer. The humans had not just learned to copy our weapons, they had made them better. Our encryption protocols, mathematical frameworks that had taken Kalori cryptographers 80 years to develop and that were considered unbreakable by every known metric, were defeated by a university student in a city called Berlin. His name was Peter Clark. He was 23 years old. He broke our primary encryption in 9 days. When we rotated to our backup protocols, he broke those in 4. When we implemented our emergency wartime encryption, reserved for scenarios where all other systems had been compromised, he broke that in 2.5 days and then, according to intercepted communications, went to sleep for 14 hours because he had not rested since he started. Peter Clark then did something that demonstrated the particular quality of human thinking that I have come to find most unsettling. He did not simply break our encryption. He published his method. He distributed it freely, to anyone who wanted it, through their global communications network. Within 48 hours, human resistance groups on every continent had the ability to intercept, decode, and read every tactical communication the Dominion transmitted on the surface of their planet. Our ground forces were effectively operating without secure communications for the remainder of the campaign. When I reviewed Clark's methodology, forwarded to me by our Signals Intelligence Division, with a note that read simply, "How is this possible?" I noticed something that chilled me more than the achievement itself. The approach he had used was not a known mathematical technique. It was not an extension of any existing cryptanalytic theory in human academic literature. He had invented a new branch of mathematics to solve the problem. 23 years old, 9 days, a new form of mathematics. To him it was a puzzle. To us it was the foundation of our military communications security. In a city called Osaka, a group of amateur radio enthusiasts, hobbyists who had previously spent their time communicating with each other across distances for entertainment, repurposed their equipment into a continent-spanning early warning network that detected our troop movements faster than our own command structure could issue orders. They used frequency-hopping patterns that changed every few seconds, based on a schedule synchronized by the lyrics of a popular song that every human in the network knew by memory. Our signals division spent a week trying to crack the pattern before realizing it was based on music. I began compiling a private database of observations that went beyond what any official report contained. I cross-referenced human capabilities against every species in our archives. The results were deeply troubling. No conquered species had ever counterattacked. Not one. In 400 conquests over 200 years, every species had followed the same trajectory: resistance, attrition, exhaustion, surrender. The duration varied. The intensity varied. The outcome never did. The humans were not following this trajectory. They were not being worn down. Our casualties had crossed 40,000. an unprecedented number, and showed no sign of slowing. More importantly, the character of the resistance was intensifying, not diminishing. Each week, the humans were better organized, better equipped, better coordinated, and angrier than the week before. This was perhaps the thing that most defied our models. The Kalori understanding of anger is that it is a brief neurological disruption, a temporary interference with rational processing that quickly passes. For humans, anger appeared to function as a sustained energy source. It did not diminish over time. It accumulated. Every loss they suffered, every city that burned, every life that ended, fed something that grew rather than faded. They were not just refusing to break, they were hardening. During the 4th week of the ground campaign, I intercepted a broadcast that I have replayed many times since. A human leader, not a military commander but a civilian official named George Ashford, stood in the ruins of what had been a government complex. The building behind him was a skeleton of charred metal and crumbling stone, open to a sky that still flickered with the light of distant fires. He was bleeding from a cut above his left eye. He appeared not to notice. He spoke for 7 minutes. The translator rendered his words in the flat, affectless tone it used for all human speech, stripping away the emotional content that the Kalori language had no capacity to convey. But even through the translator's clinical filter, the meaning was clear. He spoke about their history. He named battles and campaigns that I did not recognize but that clearly carried enormous cultural weight for the humans watching. He spoke about previous enemies who had stood where we now stood, who had believed as we now believed, who had assumed that sufficient force would produce surrender. He listed their names, and then he said something that the translator rendered with a precision that I found chilling in its simplicity. Every one of them is gone. We are still here. You are not special. You are not different. You are simply next. The broadcast went to every receiver on the planet. I monitored the human communication networks for the response, expecting at least some dissent, some voices arguing for negotiation, some faction suggesting that perhaps the cost of resistance was becoming too high. There was none. 8 billion humans heard that message, and the response, from every continent and every nation and every individual who chose to reply, was uniform. We are not finished. It was at this point that Raven Thal convened a classified strategy session, restricted to division commanders and above. I was not formally invited, but I had prepared the tactical briefing materials, which gave me a reason to be present. The discussion was brief and grim. Thal presented the casualty projections for a continued ground campaign. The numbers were unsustainable. At the current rate of attrition, the Dominion would exhaust its deployed ground forces within 6 months, and reinforcement from other sectors would leave those sectors vulnerable to unrest among other subject species. The alternative was the scouring. I had known this moment would come. The scouring was the Dominion's final option, a species-specific biological weapon engineered to attack cellular reproduction at the genetic level. It was fast. It was thorough. In the 12 previous instances of its deployment against other species, it had achieved complete extinction within 9 standard days. The Dominion did not use it often. Dead populations could not serve as labor forces, which made it economically wasteful. But it existed for situations where conventional conquest had become untenable. Thal authorized deployment without extended deliberation. 2 division commanders supported the decision. A third, a career officer named Kale Vinosh, objected on technical grounds, noting that our understanding of human biology was incomplete, and the agent might not perform as modeled. His objection was noted and overruled. I objected as well. I spoke out of turn, which is a punishable breach of protocol, but I could not remain silent. My objection was not moral. I want to be clear about this. I had participated in the scouring before, on 2 previous worlds, and I had filed my reports with the same clinical detachment I brought to every other aspect of my duties. My objection was strategic. I said, if we deploy the scouring, and it fails to achieve complete elimination, if even a small percentage of the human population survives, the survivors will not behave like any surviving population in our records. They will not scatter. They will not hide. They will rebuild, they will remember, and they will come for us. Not here. At our worlds, they will find a way. Raventhal regarded me with the patient contempt that senior officers reserve for subordinates who have spoken above their station. "Commander Serrano," he said, "they cannot leave their own atmosphere. They are trapped on a single planet, with no fleet, no fold space capability, and no means of reaching us. Where precisely would they go?" I did not have an answer for him at that moment. I have one now, and it haunts me. What I did not tell Thal, what I had discovered only hours before the meeting, was buried in a deep scan report from our Orbital Surveillance Division. On the far side of the planet, concealed beneath cloud cover and electromagnetic interference that had initially appeared natural but was demonstrably artificial, the humans had been building something. 6 launch structures, primitive by our standards, tall frameworks of metal and reinforced material designed for chemical propulsion vehicles. But mounted on those vehicles, integrated into their crude but functional payload assemblies, with a precision that our analysts found difficult to reconcile with the species' supposed technological level, were components we recognized immediately. Fold space drives. Kalori fold space drives, recovered from debris and downed vessels, reverse-engineered, rebuilt, and adapted to interface with human power and control systems. While fighting and dying in their cities, while struggling to survive a ground war against a technologically superior invader, while losing millions of their people, the humans had simultaneously been constructing a means to leave their world. They were not just defending, they were preparing to go on offense. I stared at that report in my quarters for a very long time. Then I looked out the viewport at the blue planet turning below me, burning in patches, scarred and battered but alive, still fighting, still building, still refusing, and I felt something I had not experienced since childhood. I felt afraid, not of what the humans were doing, but of what they would become when they finished doing it. The scouring was deployed on what the human calendar designated a Tuesday. I recorded the date because it seemed important somehow, though I could not have explained why. Perhaps because the humans divided their time into named segments and attached significance to each one, and I had begun, without realizing it, to see certain things through their framework rather than my own. That alone should have told me something about the effect this species was having on me. The biological agent was released from high-altitude dispersal platforms positioned above 4 of the planet's major landmasses. Atmospheric circulation models predicted complete global distribution within 48 hours. The agent itself was the product of decades of Dominion bioweapons research, tailored at the molecular level to human genetic markers using samples collected from casualties and captured individuals. Our projections indicated a lethality rate of 98.6%. Within 9 standard days, according to every model we ran, the human species would be functionally extinct. Day 1 was difficult to watch. I have been present for the scouring before, twice, and in both previous instances the target species died quietly. Their biological systems simply wound down, like mechanisms running out of power. They became still. They stopped breathing. There was a terrible peacefulness to it, if you did not think too carefully about what you were observing. Humans did not die quietly. The agent attacked their respiratory function first, then their circulatory system, then their central nervous system. It was designed to be progressive, a sequential shutdown that would immobilize the target population within 12 hours and conclude within 72. In previous deployments, the target species had been effectively incapacitated within the first half-day, unable to move or communicate, simply lying where they fell and waiting. Humans did not wait. They fought the disease the way they fought everything else, with furious, unreasonable, magnificent stubbornness. Individuals who should have been immobilized within hours remained active for days. They staggered through their cities, setting up treatment stations in basements, in tunnels, in the shells of bombed-out buildings. They shared oxygen from canisters salvaged from hospitals and industrial facilities. They pumped fluids into each other using improvised equipment assembled from medical supplies, veterinary tools, and hardware that had never been intended for biological application. Their medical professionals worked until the agent took them. Then they were replaced by others who were not medical professionals but who had obtained enough knowledge to continue. Trained doctors collapsed and veterinarians stepped into their positions. Veterinarians fell and pharmacists replaced them. Pharmacists succumbed, and ordinary citizens, people with no medical background whatsoever, picked up instruments and reference materials and tried. They organized themselves without being told to. In every city, in every town, in every settlement across the planet, humans who had never met each other before formed teams and divided responsibilities and established protocols and did work that should have required years of training, all within hours of the agent's release. A school teacher in a place called Lyon organized a triage system for 3 city blocks, using colored ribbons tied to door frames. Green meant the person inside could wait. Yellow meant they needed help soon. Red meant they were fading. She ran this system for 2 days without sleeping, walking block after block, checking on people she had never met, updating ribbons, directing the few remaining medical volunteers to where they were needed most. She survived. Many of the people she helped did not. She continued anyway. In a coastal city called Busan, a retired naval officer named Edward Marsh commandeered a fishing fleet and established a supply line across the water to bring medicine from a pharmaceutical manufacturing facility that was still operational on a nearby island. He made 17 crossings in 3 days. On the 14th crossing, his boat was struck by debris from an orbital bombardment that hit the water nearby. He transferred the medical supplies to another vessel, swam to shore, found another boat, and went back out. I watched from orbit. I watched a woman in a city called Chicago carry a child through 3 city blocks to reach a treatment station, walking through streets where the dead and dying lay in rows, her own skin showing the gray discoloration that marked the agent's progression through her system. She delivered the child, turned around, and walked back for another one. She made that trip 4 times before she collapsed. Someone else picked up the child she had been carrying and completed the journey. I watched a man named Philip Dunn, a teacher at some kind of educational institution in a place called Edinburgh, organize a distribution network for the limited medical supplies that remained. He used the same portable communication devices the humans used for everything, coordinating dozens of volunteers across the city, routing medicine and equipment to where it was needed most. He was visibly symptomatic. His hands shook. His breathing was labored. He did not stop. He worked for 3 days. On the 4th day, his communications went silent. I watched and I recorded, and I told myself that this was war, that this was the cost of resistance, that they could have surrendered, that we had given them the choice. I did not believe myself. On day 5, something happened that every model we had said was impossible. A research team at an institution in a city called Boston, led by a woman named Lucy Webb, isolated the protein structure of the biological agent, working in conditions that would have been considered unacceptable in a Dominion laboratory, with equipment that was damaged, improvised, and in some cases held together with adhesive material. They identified the mechanism by which the agent attacked human cellular reproduction, and they synthesized a countermeasure, a vaccine. Crude, imperfect, manufactured in basement laboratories and university facilities, and distributed through networks of volunteers who carried it by hand across devastated cities. It did not cure those already in the advanced stages of infection. It saved approximately 60% of those who received it in time. 40% still perished. But it was enough. The scouring, the Dominion's ultimate weapon, the instrument of absolute extinction that had ended 2 civilizations completely and without exception, had been defeated in 5 days by a species that had discovered the basic structure of its own genetic code less than 2 centuries ago. 3 of the 12 scientists on Lucy Webb's team were already gone by the time the vaccine entered distribution. Lucy Webb herself had been symptomatic since day 2. She survived, though I learned later that the agent had caused permanent damage to her respiratory system that would affect her for the rest of her life. She did not stop working until the vaccine was in production. Then she slept for 19 hours. Then she went back to work. When the data confirming the vaccine's effectiveness reached the command deck of the Eternal Verdict, the war chamber fell into a silence I had never experienced in 4 decades of service. Officers stood at their stations, staring at screens that showed a species that was supposed to be extinct, but was instead recovering, distributing medicine, treating its wounded, burying its dead, and preparing to keep fighting. Raventhal stood at the projection table for a long time. Then he said, "Increase orbital strikes on their remaining industrial centers." He did not mention the scouring. None of us ever mentioned it again. But the scouring had changed something, and not in the way it was intended to. Before the biological attack, The humans had been fighting a defensive war. They had been fierce and creative and relentless, but their objective had been protection. They were shielding their world, their people, their way of life. There had been rules, unspoken but observed. Captured Dominion soldiers had been taken prisoner and treated with rough decency, detained, confined, but given food and medical attention, and not subjected to deliberate harm. After the scouring, the rules changed. The word that appeared most frequently in human broadcasts in the days following the failed biological attack was one that the translator rendered as retribution, not defense, not protection, not survival, retribution. The humans had absorbed a blow that would have extinguished any other species, and instead of breaking, they had crystallized. Their anger, which had been building since the first day of the invasion, underwent a phase change. It became something colder and harder and infinitely more dangerous. Captured Dominion soldiers began to disappear, not harmed, as far as our intelligence could determine, but moved to undisclosed locations for purposes we could not identify. Human military broadcasts shifted tone entirely. Defensive coordination gave way to offensive planning. Generals who had been managing urban defense operations began organizing strike forces. Civilian resistance networks that had been focused on disruption began systematically targeting Dominion equipment for capture rather than destruction. They were not just surviving anymore. They were preparing. And those 6 rockets, the ones carrying modified fold-space drives that I had identified weeks earlier, were now ready. They launched on a clear morning, from 6 locations spread across 4 continents, within a window of 90 seconds. Our orbital detection grid identified them immediately. They were large by human standards but small by ours. Crude chemical propulsion vehicles that burned fuel with a violent, wasteful energy that seemed characteristic of the species that had built them. They rose through the atmosphere trailing columns of white vapor, climbing toward orbit on pillars of controlled fire. 5 of them turned toward the Dominion blockade fleet. They did not attempt evasion. They did not fire weapons. They accelerated to maximum velocity and aimed themselves directly at the largest warships they could reach. The human word for this is kamikaze. It derives from their history, from a time when human pilots flew explosive-laden aircraft into enemy vessels during a naval conflict, trading their lives for the destruction of ships many times their size. It is a concept that requires no advanced technology, no sophisticated strategy, no complex planning. It requires only the willingness to die and the certainty that your death will cost the enemy more than it costs you. Each of the 5 ships carried a modified Dominion fold-space drive. A fold-space drive is not designed to be activated within a planetary gravity well. It is absolutely not designed to be detonated as an uncontrolled energy release. The humans had modified the drives to do exactly that, turning each one into a weapon of enormous destructive potential. The 5 ships hit the blockade line and detonated. 19 Dominion warships were destroyed instantly. 11 more sustained damage so severe that they were effectively removed from service. The blockade formation, a carefully positioned array of vessels designed to prevent any craft from entering or leaving Earth orbit, shattered. The 6th ship did not attack. While the blockade fleet was consumed by the destruction of the 5 kamikaze vessels, while debris fields expanded and sensor arrays overloaded and commanders scrambled to reorganize, the 6th ship accelerated through the gap that its companions had created and engaged its fold-space drive at the outer edge of Earth's gravitational influence. It jumped. It folded space and disappeared from every sensor we had, heading outward, away from Earth, into the void between stars, in the direction of Dominion-controlled territory. I understood what they had done the moment the 6th ship vanished from my screen. The 5 attack ships had not been the objective. They were the price, the distraction, the sacrifice that cleared the path. The 6th ship was carrying a payload more dangerous than any weapon: information. A complete recording of everything that had happened since the Dominion's arrival: the invasion, the ground war, the scouring, the vaccine. The proof that the Dominion, the most powerful military force in the galaxy, had attempted to exterminate a sentient species and failed. And it was carrying navigational data reconstructed from captured Dominion systems. A map showing the location of every world under Dominion control, every conquered species, every subjugated civilization. If that ship reached any of those worlds, If any of the hundreds of enslaved species learned that someone had fought back and survived, the Dominion would not merely lose one campaign. It would lose the foundational myth that held its entire empire together, the belief that resistance was impossible. Raventhal understood this instantly. For all his arrogance, for all his dismissive contempt for the humans and their primitive capabilities, he was not a fool. He recognized an existential threat when it appeared on his tactical display. He ordered immediate withdrawal from Earth. Every ground force, every dropship, every piece of recoverable equipment. The invasion was over. The pursuit of the sixth ship was all that mattered now. As our forces pulled back from the planet, as dropships rose from the 3 battered cities and the dozens of secondary engagement zones, I stood at the observation port and watched the ground feeds for the last time. The humans were standing in their ruins. Millions of them, emerging from shelters and basements and tunnels, looking up at the sky. They were covered in dust and ash. They were gaunt and wounded and grieving. They had lost millions of their own. Their cities were devastated. Their infrastructure was in pieces. They were not celebrating. They stood in silence and watched us leave, and on their faces I saw an expression I had come to know very well over the preceding weeks. It was not joy. It was not relief. It was the quiet, absolute, implacable focus of a species that has identified its enemy and will never, for as long as it exists, look away. Some of them were writing. I could see it on the close-range camera feeds. Standing in rubble, looking up at the retreating ships, recording observations in notebooks and on electronic devices, ship configurations, formation patterns, engine signatures, retreat vectors. They were studying us. In their darkest moment, standing among their dead, they were gathering intelligence for next time. I turned from the viewport and opened a channel to the fleet's chief historian, a meticulous officer named Dravan who had served the Dominion's records division for longer than I had been alive. "I need the complete record of this campaign, classified at the highest level," I said, "sealed against all unauthorized access." Dravan was silent for a moment. "That is an unusual request, Commander. May I ask the reason?" "Because if any other species reads what happened here," I said, "they will understand what I now understand. The Dominion did not fail to conquer Earth. Earth chose not to be conquered. The humans know our weapons, our tactics, our shield frequencies, our encryption methods, and our biological vulnerabilities. They know the location of our worlds, and they are not a species that forgets." Dravan sealed the files without further questions. We caught the sixth ship. I want to be clear about this, because what comes after might suggest otherwise, and I do not want anyone reading this account to mistake what happened for something other than what it was. A fast pursuit group of 30 warships intercepted the human vessel 2-fold jumps from the nearest Dominion colony world. It was a small ship, barely larger than one of our shuttlecraft, held together by a combination of human engineering and stolen Dominion technology that our technical analysts later described as functional but aesthetically distressing. It was piloted by a single individual, a human named Simon Hale. Simon Hale did not attempt to evade. He did not attempt to surrender. He did not change course or reduce speed, or take any action that suggested he expected to survive the encounter. When I later reviewed his personnel file, reconstructed from the human military records we had intercepted, I learned that Simon Hale had been a commercial transport pilot before the invasion. He flew cargo aircraft between human cities, hauling freight and mail. He had a wife and 2 children in a city called Portland. He had volunteered for the mission knowing that it was a one-way flight, knowing that the 5 ships flying ahead of him existed solely to buy him a few seconds of clear space, knowing that even if he made it past the blockade, the probability of reaching any inhabited system before being intercepted was vanishingly small. He went anyway. He kissed his family goodbye and climbed into a ship made from scraps of alien technology and human determination, and launched himself into the void to deliver a message he would never know whether anyone received. This is what humans do. This is what they have always done. They send their best into the darkness on missions they know will probably fail. And they go, not because they believe they will succeed, but because they believe the attempt matters. They have a saying that the translator rendered imperfectly, but that I have come to understand. Someone has to be first. It means that progress requires sacrifice. That every door that opens does so because someone walked up to it not knowing whether it was a door or a wall. That the person who goes first rarely benefits from what they find. Simon Hale was first. He went, and he broadcast for 11 seconds, and then he was gone. He opened every transmission channel his ship possessed and began broadcasting. Everything. The invasion footage, the scouring documentation, the navigational data, the coordinates of Earth, all of it, at maximum power, on every frequency the ship could reach, in every direction. The pursuit group destroyed his vessel 11 seconds later. 11 seconds. We jammed what we could. Our electronic warfare systems were able to disrupt a significant portion of the broadcast before it propagated beyond our containment range. Our analysts spent days calculating the likely reach of the unblocked signal and concluded that the probability of meaningful reception by any inhabited system was low. We believed at the time that we had contained the situation. We told ourselves this. We wrote it in our reports. We briefed our commanders, and they briefed their commanders, and everyone agreed that the Earth incident, while regrettable and more costly than anticipated, was over. The quarantine would hold. The humans were trapped. The message had been silenced. I am writing this from the hold of a civilian transport vessel at the far edge of explored space. I resigned my commission 14 months ago. I have sold my uniforms, surrendered my service medallions, and erased every piece of identifying information that connects me to the Dominion military. I am not the only officer who has done this. In the past 2 years, the Dominion has lost more personnel to resignation, retirement, and outright desertion than it lost in the entire Earth campaign. Let me tell you what happened, and let me tell you why I am running. After the retreat from Earth, the Dominion implemented a full quarantine of the Sol system. Automated weapons platforms were deployed in a spherical perimeter around the system's outer boundary. Sensor networks capable of detecting fold space signatures, electromagnetic emissions, and physical objects down to the size of a small vehicle were activated and set to continuous monitoring. The official position, communicated to all Dominion worlds and subject species, was that Sol 3 had been a minor operation, concluded successfully, the indigenous population eliminated, nothing further to discuss. For 1 standard year, the quarantine held. No human ships were detected, no transmissions were intercepted. The sensor nets reported nothing but the natural emissions of an ordinary star system. The Dominion's attention shifted elsewhere, to other sectors, other operations, other species that needed reminding of their position within the established order. Then, 14 months after our retreat from Earth, a ship appeared in orbit above Kalori Prime. Not a fleet, not a squadron, not even a patrol craft. A single vessel, occupying a stable orbit above the Dominion's capital world, as casually as if it had been invited. It was not a ship we recognized. It was not constructed from salvaged Dominion components, like the crude vehicles the humans had launched during the Earth campaign. It was built entirely from human-originated technology, engineered from principles that our analysts studied for weeks and could not fully explain. Its propulsion system operated on a framework our physicists did not have a name for. Its hull composition included materials that did not appear in any known periodic classification. Its stealth capability was so far beyond anything in our inventory that our most advanced detection systems had registered it as background radiation. This ship had been built in 14 months. 14 months earlier, the humans had been a pre-spaceflight civilization fighting for survival in ruined cities. In the time it had taken the Dominion to file the after-action reports and process the administrative paperwork for the Earth withdrawal, the humans had developed propulsion technology that exceeded our own, mastered materials science we could not replicate, and built a vessel capable of crossing the galaxy undetected. I want to emphasize what this means. The Kalori civilization is over 12,000 years old. Our spaceflight technology has developed over millennia, through slow, methodical, incremental advancement. The humans accomplished in 14 months what had taken us centuries. They did not progress along the same path we had walked. They found a different path entirely, one we had not known existed, and they sprinted down it with the desperate velocity of a species that had looked extinction in the face and decided never to be that vulnerable again. It had bypassed the Sol quarantine net. It had crossed Dominion space. It had penetrated the defensive perimeter of our homeworld. And it had done all of this without triggering a single alarm on a single sensor, on a single platform, anywhere along the route. The ship remained in orbit for 3 minutes and 47 seconds. During that time, it broadcast a single message on a frequency that every receiver on Kalori Prime could access, from military installations, to civilian households, to the personal communication devices in the pockets of ordinary citizens walking the streets below. The message contained 3 components. The first was a set of coordinates, the precise location of Earth, accurate to a degree that exceeded our own navigational charts, accompanied by detailed route data for reaching it from any point in Dominion space. The second was a recording, complete, unedited, high-resolution documentation of the Dominion's invasion of Earth, the initial assault, the ground battles, the destruction of cities, the deployment of the scouring, the millions of human dead, the failed extinction, all of it, preserved with a clarity that made it impossible to dismiss as fabrication. The third component was a single sentence, delivered in flawless Kalori by a human voice. You are not alone. They can be beaten. The ship vanished before the first weapons platform completed its targeting sequence. It was there, and then it was not. No fold space signature, no detectable departure vector. It simply ceased to be present, as if it had never existed. We tried to contain the message. We deployed signal jamming across the planet within minutes. We dispatched security teams to confiscate recording devices. We issued emergency decrees prohibiting the reproduction or distribution of the broadcast. We arrested individuals found in possession of copies. It did not matter. The message had been received by an estimated 900 million Kalori civilians in the 3 minutes and 47 seconds it was broadcast. Within hours, copies were circulating through channels we could not monitor, and networks we did not know existed. Within days, it had left Kalori Prime entirely, carried outward by traders and travelers and diplomats and military personnel to colony worlds and outposts and supply stations across the Dominion. Within 3 months, every subjugated species in the Dominion had heard it. Within 6 months, they had all seen the recording. The effect was not immediate, it was gradual, like the first cracks appearing in a structure that has been under stress for far longer than anyone realized. But once those cracks appeared, they spread with a speed that our political analysts had not predicted and could not control. Within 1 standard year, 11 of the Dominion's subject species launched coordinated revolts, not because the humans instructed them to. There was no evidence of any communication between Earth and the rebelling species, no coordination, no alliance, no shared planning. The humans had not organized a galactic resistance movement. They had done something far more devastating. They had provided proof of concept. They had shown, through the simple fact of their survival, that the Dominion was not invincible, that its weapons could be countered, that its strategies could be defeated, that its authority rested not on genuine supremacy, but on the belief in that supremacy, a belief that the humans had shattered simply by refusing to submit to it. Every conquered species in the galaxy had spent years, decades, in some cases centuries, believing that resistance was futile, that the Dominion was too powerful to oppose, that the cost of rebellion was extinction, and that the proof of this was the long list of species that had tried and failed. The humans had erased that proof. They had replaced it with a different message, a simpler one, spoken in a language that every oppressed species in the galaxy understood regardless of their biology, or their culture, or their history. They can be beaten. The revolts were not all successful. Several were crushed with extreme force. Others settled into protracted conflicts that consumed Dominion resources and attention. 3 succeeded outright, with subject species expelling Dominion forces from their worlds and establishing independent defense systems. The remaining conflicts are ongoing. New ones begin regularly. The most significant revolt was the Thesari Uprising, because the Thesari had been among the most compliant of the Dominion's subject species for over a century. They had been conquered early in the Dominion's expansion, and they had adapted to subjugation with what we interpreted as acceptance. They served in our labor forces. They staffed our manufacturing facilities. They followed our regulations without visible complaint. When they saw the recording of what happened on Earth, when they watched a species with far less technology and far fewer resources than the Thesari possessed stand against the Dominion and survive, Something in them changed. Not overnight. Over months. Quietly. The way water changes stone, not through force but through persistence. They began with small acts of non-compliance, quotas missed by small margins, equipment malfunctions that could not be attributed to deliberate sabotage but occurred with suspicious frequency, transportation delays, communication errors, nothing dramatic, nothing that justified a military response, just a steady, gentle friction that slowed the machinery of Dominion control to a crawl. By the time our administrators recognized the pattern for what it was, the Thesari had spent 6 months quietly stockpiling resources, establishing communication networks, and training. When they finally acted openly, they did it with a coordination that our intelligence services had completely failed to detect. The Thesari revolt lasted 9 weeks. When it was over, there were no Dominion soldiers on Thesari Prime. The Thesari had not used violence to drive them out. They had used something more sophisticated. They had made the occupation economically unsustainable. Every system the Dominion relied on to extract value from the planet simply stopped functioning. Not sabotaged, just stopped. Entire populations refused to work, refused to trade, refused to participate in any activity that supported the occupation. The Dominion could not imprison an entire planet. It could not operate the factories and mines and processing facilities with its own personnel. After 9 weeks, the cost of maintaining the occupation exceeded the value being extracted, and the withdrawal order was issued. The Thesari had learned this from the humans. Not directly. They had never communicated with Earth, but they had watched the recording. They had seen what was possible, and they had adapted the lesson to their own strengths. This is what the humans did. Not through weapons or fleets or military campaigns, through an idea, through the simple, devastating proof that the Dominion could be defied. The Dominion is not collapsing. I want to be accurate about this. It is not falling apart overnight, but it is fracturing. Colony worlds that had been stable for centuries are experiencing unrest. Species that had been compliant for generations are asking questions they had never dared to ask before. Military resources that had been allocated for expansion are being redirected to internal security. The machine is still running, but it is consuming more and more of its own energy just to keep itself intact, and the trajectory is clear to anyone willing to look at it honestly. The humans have not launched a single offensive operation beyond their own solar system. They have not sent a fleet. They have not issued demands. They have not attacked a single Dominion installation or colony world. They have not needed to. They broke something more fundamental than our military capability. They broke the idea that the Dominion was unchallengeable, the idea that resistance led only to destruction, the idea that the galaxy belonged to the strong, and the strong were us. They broke it by standing in the ashes of their own cities and refusing to kneel. I have spent the months since my resignation, doing something that no Kalori military officer has ever done before, to my knowledge. I have studied the humans, not their technology, which our engineers can analyze, not their tactics, which our strategists can model. I have studied them, their history, their culture, their literature, their art, their philosophy, the records we intercepted during the campaign, and the data I have been able to acquire since, through channels I would prefer not to describe. What I have found is the reason I am running. Every species the Dominion has conquered had a breaking point, a threshold of suffering beyond which they chose submission over extinction. This is a rational calculation. When the cost of resistance exceeds the cost of surrender, a rational species surrenders. Our entire military doctrine is built on this principle. Apply sufficient force to make resistance more painful than compliance, and compliance will follow. Humans do not have a breaking point. I do not mean this as hyperbole. I have searched their entire recorded history for an instance in which a human population, subjected to overwhelming force and offered the option of surrender, chose submission permanently. I cannot find one. I find temporary capitulations. I find strategic retreats. I find populations that bent under pressure and then, years or decades or generations later, rose again and drove their oppressors out. I find, over and over and over again, the same pattern. An invader arrives, an invader conquers, an invader rules, and then the invader is gone, and the humans remain. They do not have a threshold, they have something else, something our psychologists do not have a model for, and our philosophers do not have a concept for. It is a quality that makes them willing to endure any amount of suffering, absorb any amount of damage, sacrifice anything and everything they have, rather than accept permanent defeat. It is not courage exactly, because courage implies a choice, and for humans it does not appear to be a choice at all. It is simply what they are. They will burn their own cities. They will poison their own water. They will collapse their own bridges and flood their own tunnels and destroy the work of generations in a single afternoon. They will walk into certain death-carrying messages or medicine, or simply defiance. They will tell jokes while they are bleeding. They will laugh in the dark. They will carry children through streets full of the fallen. They will build vaccines in basements, and weapons in kitchens, and starships in secret, while the sky burns above them, and the ground shakes beneath them, and the enemy closes in from every direction. And they will never, ever stop. The Kalori are a species that prizes logic above all other qualities. We make decisions based on calculation, probability, and rational self-interest. We do not understand the humans because the humans do not operate within a framework we can model. You cannot calculate the breaking point of a species that does not have one. You cannot predict the surrender of a species that does not surrender. You cannot conquer a species that would rather cease to exist than exist on your terms. You can only avoid them. I want to close with something that has kept me awake during the long transit hours aboard this transport ship, something I keep returning to when I close my eyes and try to convince myself that the distance I am putting between myself and the Sol system is sufficient. The ship that appeared above Kalori Prime, the one that broadcast the message that started 11 revolutions, was crewed by a single human, one individual, one person, alone, in a ship built by a species we had tried to exterminate, flew into the heart of the most powerful empire in the known galaxy, delivered a message that fundamentally altered the political structure of a quarter of inhabited space, and departed before we could even point a weapon in their direction. That is what one human did. One, acting alone, in a ship that should not have existed, using technology they should not have been able to develop, executing a mission that should not have been possible. There are 8 billion of them, and they are building. Our long-range sensors, the ones that still function despite the quarantine zone's increasing opacity, detect energy signatures from within the Sol system that our analysts cannot explain. Manufacturing output that exceeds what any single planet should be capable of producing. Electromagnetic emissions consistent with research programs operating at scales we have difficulty measuring. Gravitational anomalies suggesting the construction of structures in orbit that dwarf anything the humans possessed before our invasion. We taught them that the galaxy was hostile. We taught them that their survival depended on being stronger and faster and smarter than anything else out there. We taught them, through the scouring, that the penalty for losing was extinction. Before we came, they had been a divided species, fighting among themselves, spending their creative energy on internal disputes and petty conflicts. They were formidable even then, but their power was diffused, turned inward, wasted on rivalries that consumed resources and lives, without producing anything of lasting value. We united them. We gave them a common enemy. We gave them a reason to stop fighting each other and start fighting together. We showed them what they could accomplish when 8 billion minds turned in the same direction. We forged them into a single weapon, and then, through the scouring, we gave that weapon a target. We did this. The Dominion created the very thing it now fears. We walked onto a world full of fractured, quarreling, brilliant, stubborn, creative, indestructible beings, and we gave them the one thing they had lacked: unity. And they are very, very good at learning. I am often asked by the few people who know my history, what should be done about the humans? Young officers, nervous diplomats, curious civilians who have heard the rumors and want to know if they are true. My answer is always the same. Nothing. You do nothing. You leave them alone. You let them keep their small blue world and their loud music and their chaotic, passionate, impossible lives. You do not provoke them. You do not threaten them. You do not give them a reason to look outward with anger in their hearts and purpose in their eyes. Because I have seen what happens to those who make enemies of humans. I have seen it in their history, written in the ruins of every empire that ever tried to hold them down. I have seen it with my own eyes, written in the debris fields of 19 warships and the silence of a failed extinction. They do not forgive. They do not forget. They pass their grievances down through generations like inheritance, nurturing them, sharpening them, waiting with a patience that seems impossible for so brief-lived a species, until the moment comes to answer them. And when that moment comes, they do not negotiate, and they do not show restraint, and they do not accept surrender. They finish it. Every empire that attacked them is dust. Every invader that tried to rule them is a cautionary tale in their history books. Every force that attempted to break them broke itself against them instead. And the humans? The humans write the books. They write the songs and tell the stories and raise their children on the memories of what was done and what was answered. They remember. That is their gift and their weapon and the thing that makes them, despite their small stature and their fragile bodies, and their absurdly brief individual lifespans, the most dangerous species in this galaxy. I am going to the far rim. I am going to find a quiet world orbiting a dim star as far from the Sol system as physics will allow, and I am going to live there, and I am going to hope that the distance is enough. Not because the humans are chasing me. They are not. Not yet. Not today. Perhaps not in my lifetime. But I have read their history. All of it. Every page. Every war. Every occupation. Every injustice that was answered, sometimes centuries after it was committed, by descendants who had never personally suffered it, but who remembered it as if they had. The lesson of that history is simple. They always come. And we gave them a reason. So I run. I go quietly into the dark between the stars, and I leave this record behind, and I hope that someone reads it, and understands, and makes the only wise decision that can be made regarding the inhabitants of that small blue world in the outer spiral. Leave them alone. Leave them to their arguments and their music and their strange, furious, beautiful lives. Because the alternative is to stand in their path and learn the lesson that every invader in their history has learned. It is a lesson taught in fire and written in the silence that follows. They are coming. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, maybe not for 100 years. But they are coming. And they remember everything.